Today's head-on is Nick Carthew's Visitor, Adventure of a Guide in the Wilds near Old Katahdin. The subhead-on says, Tackled by a madman in a lonely camp far in the forest, saved by a dog who bore a message and brought a welcome helper. Something strange and unusual, I said, glancing at the trapper's weather-beaten face as we sat together in front of a log fire in the hall of the Silver Lake Hotel at Katahdin Ironworks late in the fall, says C.M. Penner in Lewiston Journal. The only thing that ever happened to me that might interest you was when I was tackled by a madman, and that was one Christmas day nigh on to 12 years ago. Here I pricked up my ears, for Nick Carthew always had a good story to tell, despite what he might say to the contrary. As boy and man, he has passed the past 40 years in the Maine forest, and the most inaccessible portions of the wilderness are as familiar to him as the city we may live in is to us. He has hunted, trapped, and in search of game has penetrated into regions where few white men go. In build and appearance, he is a typical son of the woods, straight as a cedar tree, tough as a yellow birch, with a certain rough dignity about him that sprang from a long familiarity with the danger and the consequent necessary for self-resource and quick action. Go on, Nick, I responded. It is only of late years that the sports have been coming right along in numbers to keep a man going all the season, and before that time, I used to do a power more trapping and hunting than I do now. One of my favorite bits of country was up above Katahdin. For 3 seasons, I camped at the base of the mountain in Township 14, right where a branch of the Allagash wound round it. It was wild there and quiet, and solemn as a graveyard. Few ever got as far into the woods as that in those days unless they lost their way and strayed there. Months would go by and I wouldn't see no human face except it was Jack Hodds, who generally staked it somewhere near me, or an Indian. My camp was one of the best I ever had. The black moors, the 2 ends and the top were of solid rock. The front was made of logs cut a purpose, and the smoke went out through a hole in the top. At the time I am speaking of, I had with me as a companion a fine beagle hound that a pard gave me, and I reckon that same dog saved my life, though he wasn't perhaps aware he did it. One day near Christmas, I was preparing my evening meal after a pretty long tramp when the door of my cabin was suddenly opened, and looking up, I saw before me the strangest looking creature that ever mortal set eyes on. A man? Yes, a man, but so tall that though my doorway was 6 feet high, he had to stoop to get in, and he was altogether of a wild and ferocious appearance. His hair fell in clotted masses about his shoulders. His beard reached nearly to his waist. His long, muscular arms were partially bare, showing a multitude of scars and deep scratches, and though it was cold weather, he had nothing above his waist except a ragged shirt. He wore a pair of deerskin breeches and some rough-made moccasins. In his hand he carried a long-barreled, old-fashioned rifle, and at his belt hung a bare-bladed hunting knife. His fingernails were fully an inch long and looked as if they had been used to dig up earth. He gave a grunt when I asked him to take a seat, but neither moved in nor out. Come in and have a bite, I said after 2 or 3 minutes had passed. Supper's about ready. Come far, partner? Though he looked sort of tough and ugly, I wasn't going to abuse the laws of hospitality. Still he made no reply, but after the lapse of a few minutes shut the door with a bang and squatted down on the ground with his back against the door. I busied myself about my cooking, and in a short time I had some deer steak and hot bread on a table I had made of cedar splits. Now then, I called to the stranger, time to eat. Haven't much variety, but here's plenty of it such as it is, and being hungry myself, started right in. Still, to my surprise, my visitor didn't move nor speak, and getting a little tired of that, I didn't press him any more. I guess that fetched him, as before I'd taken a couple of mouthfuls, he came forward and began to devour the meat eagerly, never using a knife or fork, but tearing it in pieces with his fingers and then pushing it down with a big hunk of bread. My, how he did eat! I never had a very fancy appetite myself, but he ate more at that meal than I would put away in 4, and quite cleaned me out of cooked victuals, all the while never saying a word, but refusing a pipe of tobacco I offered him by shaking his head. Getting up, I started to clear away the things and noticed that as soon as I turned, he again took up his position near the door. For some little time I dodged about, tending to this thing and that, thinking that my new acquaintance would most likely get up and go about as suddenly as he had come. Then when I got all done, I turned around to reach up to the pegs for my rifle, intending to clean it, but to my surprise it wasn't there. Swinging around quicker than greased lightning, for I knew that gun of mine didn't get down off those pegs on its own account, I looked at the stranger. He was there sure enough, and inside of him stood my Winchester, but how he got at it without my knowing it, I couldn't think. "Say," I said, taking a step towards him, "that's my gun, ain't it? Hand it over, will you? I want to give her a shine." Then the first thing I knew, I was looking down the barrel of a rifle that the cuss I just fed was pointing at me. "What you playing at?" I asked with sickly grin as I walked back to the other side of the cabin. "That ain't the right way to treat a man." Then I sat down on the table and waited for his answer, but he hadn't even the manners to do that, but just glared at me and kept his rifle leveled at my head. 5, 10, yes, 15 minutes passed away, while all the time I was growing doubtful how it was going to end. Then his lips moved and he uttered a noise, and drawing his knife, he laid it on the floor. At first I didn't tumble to it, then his noise grew louder, and putting back his knife into his belt, he drew it out again and made a sign for me to do the same. Yes, he wanted me to give up the weapon, but I did not see the fun of it and told him so. He shut his teeth together with a noise like a steel trap and pointed his gun in a way that soon made me give in. "There," I said, "take it," and I pitched my pelt lifter on the ground in front of him. Perhaps it was well I did so, for it sort of pacified him. After he reached forward and got it, he lowered the gun, though he still held on to it as he sat with his back against the door. Hours passed like this and midnight came. So long as I did not move, he was all right, but if I stirred the least bit, that cuss brought the rifle to his shoulder and glared at me. Long about 1 o'clock, he allowed me to throw some wood on the fire, and I took the chance to stretch myself out on the floor, for I was so darn sleepy I could hardly keep awake. This after muttering a little he didn't object to, and when I again opened my eyes it was daybreak, and there sat that man just the same. "Mornin', partner," I sang out, for the sleep I'd got had braced me up a bit, and I judged it was best to put a bold face on. But the very first step I took toward him, he was at the old game, looking out for it uglier than ever. About noon that day, which as I said was Christmas, my dog, who'd been running in and out through the hole in the front of the cabin cut a purpose for him, brought in a rabbit and laid it at my feet as I told him to do. That distracted the madman's attention, and raising his gun he made a motion which said plain enough, "Hand it over here." With a hearty curse, said quite to myself, I threw it to him, and hang me if he didn't start to tear the skin off with his teeth and eat it raw. He used one hand, though, hanging on to the rifle with the other. It came near making me sick to see him, for he didn't look any more like a man, but sort of turned into a wild animal. I guess the beagle thought so too, for he gave a growl, then came and lay down beside me. As the dog did so, the thought flashed through me that if I could send him to Jake Hod's camp with a note, all might be well yet. He had been in the habit of carrying messages between us all winter. Sure enough, he'd go now if I could get one written without the mad fellow twigging. I started to play with the dog, unloosing the collar and putting it back again, while my unwelcome visitor continued to tear at the rabbit. Presently I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket, and using a blue pencil I just happened to have about me, I wrote on it, "Jake, come at once. Mad fellow in my cabin got the drop on me with a gun. Break in the door, but give a whistle first, and be quiet and quick, for he has ears like a fox." This I twisted up and rolled about to make believe it wasn't anything. Then, watching my chance, I tied a bit of string around it, hitching it to the animal's collar, and started him off with a wave of my hand, same as I always did. In about 10 seconds, that dog was on his way, and I was alone again with the maniac. Nor did he go a minute too soon either, for when that cannibal had finished gorging himself, he turned his attention to me, and for the next 2 hours, I tell you, he made things pretty lively. Raising his firearm, he pointed it at me, working his mouth and face at the same time in a most awful manner, and making a motion for me to get up. I did so. Then he rose to his feet and went through a dumb show, nodding toward the rear of the cabin and waving his gun in a circle like. This he repeated 3 times in succession. Then it struck me, he wanted me to walk, and walk I did with him after me, round and round that there place in a way, if it weren't dangerous, would have tickled me. I bet there never was a dumber show since the days of Father Adam. As it was, I didn't even smile, but the cold sweat just poured off me, for I expected nothing less than to be brained or riddled with him at the back of me all the time. Jake's camp was about 6 miles, and as it was an hour or more after midday when my dog left, I knew he couldn't reach me much before sundown. To hold out till then and not rile the cuss was my sole aim. About 4 o'clock he let up, getting I guess a bit tired, for he made for his seat by the door again, and let me take mine on the table. This time I was all on the listen for Jake, and had made up my mind just exactly what I would do when I heard his whistle. I reckoned I could grab the rough board table and with that before me run right at him, calculating he would be taken too much by surprise to shoot. Just at that moment, I heard a low whistle, and Crash came to blow against the door. With a yell, I caught up that table and bounded at him, striking his rifle from his hands as he started up. Crash came another blow from Jake's axe, and it came through the door. Then we were all three on the ground, struggling together. How he did fight! Once it even seemed like he would succeed in mastering us both. He was so powerful. To this day, I carry the marks he gave me. At last, Jake managed to catch him a blow on the head. That was all that stopped him from squeezing the life out of me. Before he could come to again, we bound him up so tight with ropes that he looked as if he got tangled in a hammock. When he did recover and found himself beaten, his rage was terrible to see. No, he didn't escape from no asylum. It appears he was a school teacher at one time in Machias who got cranky because his girl died and who wandered off to the woods where he had lived several years before he struck me. His folks all thought he was dead, but see, he wasn't, and had been living almost like a wild animal. And I afterwards heard how he had showed up at a settlement once and got some old clothes and a woman cut and sewed some skins for him. With the exception of that one time, I've always enjoyed Christmas Day, and as long as I have my health and you chaps are willing to give me $3 a day to take you about, I guess I always will. This was Nick Carthew's story as he told it to me at Silver Lake Katahdin Iron Works on the edge of the Moosehead Wilderness. This story comes from the great state of Massachusetts, being reported in the Boston Daily Globe of January 16, 1893. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.